the bells resounding.
So I'd like to invite SAMRA and Lucy to come on stage, as well as invite Lynn Gehl to come from us from Peterborough. Hello, Lynn. My name is Hélène Giroux, and I'm the director of the Wakefield Writers Festival. On behalf of the festival, we welcome guests on the territory of the Algonquin people, who for over 200 years have received us all as their guests. Together, we recognize that we gather on land that is unceded Algonquin territory. We acknowledge this with respectful thanks, advocacy, and action towards reparation and reconciliation. We're delighted to be back, especially here at the center. We call it home. And an interesting story, throughout the last year, the center was our vaccination clinic. And it stopped being that a couple of months ago. And because of that, we're here together this afternoon. It reopened its doors with the festival this year. So that's, thank you very much for to the center. And a reminder that for everyone's safety, we would ask that you keep your masks on while seated, and except when perhaps you're having a glass of your beverage of choice or eating something. Thank you. In Conversation closes this year's fete. We've had a marvelous festival up to date. We've had poetry, music, song, words, conversations. We've cried, we've laughed, we've been provoked. We've been asked to think, we've been asked to question. And this afternoon is going to be just a continuation of that. And it's wonderful to be able to be here at our close with three remarkable women, SAMRA ZAFAR, Dr. Lynn Gehl, and Lucy van Oldenbarneveld. This is our first hybrid festival. Yes? This is our first hybrid festival, and we're also delighted to welcome our online audience from across Canada. It's our 7th edition, and we're a bit different this year. We've all seen how the pandemic has shone a light on vulnerabilities, inequalities, on climate challenges. And our theme this year, perhaps ambitious, is the power to transform. And we hope to show, and we hoped that our past week showed, how the literary and the performing arts can contribute to the wider social and environmental movements of our time, and can perhaps sometimes answer the question, what can I do? We commissioned 7 new works for this festival from Canadian authors and artists, singer-songwriters Lynn Miles and Maria Dunn, Ottawa's poet laureate and Algonquin spiritual teacher Albert Dumont, classical musicians Julie Legal and Fanny Bray Marks, artist Spencer Hannah Hayworth, and playwright Joel Birnbaum. Each of their works that we commissioned connected our audience to important social issues of our time and using these artists' and authors' creative processes. And just to make a comment, 2 of Spencer Hannah Hayworth's works, early sketches, are at the back of the room. And his work is inspired by his encounters with the homeless, many of whom he counts as friends. And they were featured this week at our Wednesday night event, where we featured the verbatim theater play by Joel Birnbaum, Home is a Beautiful Word. He specially adapted it for our festival. There's a lot of thanks, especially at this close of the festival. I've already warned SAMRA and Lucy and now Lynn that my introduction is a little bit long, but that we will get to the afternoon's performance very soon. Claude, could you raise the lights? Oh, can you put one in the corner too, or? It's okay. So funders and sponsors, the Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, the English Language Arts Network, la MRC des collines de l'Outaouais par le biais de l'entente de développement culturel avec le ministère de la Culture et des Communications du Québec et notre propre municipalité de La Pêche. Nous vous remercions. As well, this year, who made this festival possible? And I'd ask you to keep your applause, and we'll give a great big round after everyone. Al Connors and his team, responsible for live stream production. Al, you made it look so easy, your magic of live stream production. Thank you. Greg Brown, you gave us great sound, and thank you very much for gently telling me to not speak into the camera. John Schmidt, he's working with us from Sarnia, and he's responsible for digital marketing. John, you're listening online. Thank you for connecting us with an audience from coast to coast to coast throughout the week. Chris Corcoran, my dear friend, festival advisor, truth sayer, and our web mistress extraordinaire. Elise Marlene, our graphic designer, who is responsible for our beautiful graphic. Francisca Hines, photography. She's here this afternoon. Erica Bass, tickets. Lisa M. Cowan, communications. Shelley Crabtree, responsible for all of our extraordinary volunteers that are here with us. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. The Centre Wakefield La Pêche, Irene Richardson, David Park, and Claude Laroche. Jim Sherman, our bookseller from Perfect Books in Ottawa. Thank you for being with us again. Last but not least, a festival coordinator and my dear friend, Peter Gillies. So this is who made this festival possible. Thank you. Before we begin, a festival tradition. We honor a community actor who has made an outstanding cultural contribution to our community in literacy and social advocacy. We had an honoree last night, and this afternoon we're privileged to honor Bearing Witness Canada, a project of reconciliation, a response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. Bearing Witness was created by Paul Brown out of his own deep personal commitment to reconciliation and creates spaces for understanding through study and conversation between Indigenous people and Canadian settler society. He says, "In my evolution as a human being and in my commitment to the truth, I am compelled to express my life's work and legacy to humanity by bearing witness to the shared history. Each of us individually and Canadian society has everything to gain by embarking on this journey of reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, as we have been called to do by the Commission and the Truth presented in the final report." Among many others, Paul created the On the Path to Reconciliation book discussion group, organized a series of workshops, Fundamentals of Understanding, in celebration of National Indigenous Heritage Day, offered the 7 Valleys Towards Reconciliation, screened the Grizzlies, followed by a panel discussion with actors and producers, and for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, offered Dr. Gehl's talk on Debwin, valuing the importance of Indigenous sacred places. Please join me in paying tribute to Paul Brown and his guests this evening. Paul, can you please stand? Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Lucy van Oldenbarneveld, our host. Until recently, Lucy co-anchored the flagship newscast CBC Ottawa News at 6. Her work was recognized with a Canadian Screen Award nomination, a Gemini nomination, and the Gold World Medal for Best Talk Interview Program at the New York Festival. Lucy is now pursuing new life dreams, that of storyteller, actress, and theater producer. Her one-woman show, Me, Vivian, Lay in the Roller Rink, tells her story of growing up in Hamilton during the steel strikes, a recession, and overwhelming patriarchy that ruled everywhere, except at the local roller rink. It will be shown at the Undercurrents Theatre Festival in February, not to be missed. Lucy, we're delighted to welcome you back to the festival. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hélène. I thank you for that introduction, and it is so great to be here again. to an in-person event. How great is this? We've talked about how wonderful it is to see you all, just like sitting there in person. And so that's never going to get old. I'd like to thank Hélène and the Writers Fest team for forging ahead with this event and just making it possible for us all to be here safely and excitedly. So, and also, a little birdie told me that it's Hélène's birthday today. So make sure, happy birthday. So we have two parts to this event this afternoon. The first, we'll hear from SAMRA and Lynn. They'll introduce their stories a bit. Then we'll talk about that for about 40 minutes or so. We're going to take a quick intermission. Then we'll have another 15 or 20 minutes after that for primarily questions from you. So start thinking about that in advance, and we'll have a microphone, and you can ask your question. And if you're listening at home, you can also send your questions in. I'm sure there's a little chat, and Hélène will be collecting those for us. So as you've gathered, and that's why you're all here with us, we have two amazing women with us today. SAMRA ZAFAR was a precocious young girl with a bright future. Growing up in a Pakistani family, her family lived in the UAE. Her dreams of university and career supported by her parents, at least at first. Then, as a teenager, only 16 years old, she couldn't escape the cultural pressure to accept an arranged marriage proposal. SAMRA then moved to Canada with her new husband, Ahmed. She lived with him and his parents in Mississauga. In many ways, SAMRA paints a picture in her book of a life of being held captive in that lovely salmon-colored house in the suburbs. Her book is A Good Wife Escaping the Life I Never Chose. Hello, SAMRA. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. It's working.
It's
yes,
working.
Yes,
okay, great.
Anyway, hello, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I'm so thrilled to be here. And thank you all for being here. This is absolutely fabulous.
And now let me introduce to you Dr. Lynn Gehl. She is an Algonquin Anishinaabe, an author, advocate, public speaker, and an artist. She is also a tenacious and brave litigant. In her book, Gehl versus Canada, Challenging Sex Discrimination in the Indian Act, Lynn takes us through her 30-year fight against the Canadian government, or as she argues in her book, against colonialism itself. The result, as we will hear, is that thousands of Indigenous mothers will now be able to pass on their status to their children. In everything Lynn does, she practices with the Indigenous paradigm. And as part of her presentation today, Lynn will also describe what she means by Indigenous knowledge that guides her. Dr. Lynn Gehl joins us from Peterborough today. Hello, Lynn. There she is. Lynn, before we start, maybe I can pass things over to you to do a welcome for us.
Miigwech Gazamanadao, Miigwech Gazamanadao, Miigwech Wabanan Nikia, Miigwech Sangnang Nikia, Miigwech Ibugansmag Nikia, Miigwech Gewenang Nikia, Miigwech Gazamanadao. So I just said thank you to the creator and thank you to the four directions.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for starting us off that way. What an honor to begin things. Miigwech for that. Lynn, your book is so expansive. It is so rich in detail. 30 years, and you've cleverly boiled it down into 3 slides for us. So maybe that's where we can start. Al Connors, our tech director, has made sure that we can all see Lynn's slides. We're going to watch them up here, and Lynn will take us through her epic fight against the Canadian government. So Lynn, I'll throw it over to you for that explanation.
Oh, first I'd like to say, Kwe Makanak Dodam, Kitchisipi and Dunjaba, Nagojo Wan Megwan Dida, Gizikete, Manado Kwe Indigenous Cause, and Da Shaganashi, Noswin Lynn Gehl, Up to Go and Do, Chanandam, and Ishnabi Kwe Wayan. So it's really important for me as an Algonquin person to begin with a traditional opening and tell you who I am, tell you what my name is, and let you know that I am an Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I'm zooming in from Peterborough. And I am a proud Algonquin Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe woman. So it's important that I tell you that because for us, for the Anishinaabe people, knowledge is subjective and it comes from within. So on the first slide that I prepared, it just asks people to keep in mind that Indigenous knowledge brings different ways of knowing to the knowledge feasting table. So for example, Anishinaabe people value subjective knowledge as well as objective knowledge, experiential knowledge, emotional knowledge, reasoned knowledge, practice knowledge, as well as moral knowledge. So we bring different kinds of knowing, different ways of knowing to the knowledge feasting table. And that's just a collage I made of called Urban Feast. So that was my first slide. Did you want me to go on to the second slide, Lucy?
If you could set up your story for us that you tell us in the book. Yes, please.
Sure. So I think that Al was going to pop it up.
Yeah, it's up there. It's up there.
Oh, miigwech, Al, you're so great. So this is a timeline that I made. It's such a long process that I've been on. Lucy said that suggested it was a 30-year process, but it was actually an intergenerational process. So it began with my great-grandmother in 1945 when she asked if she was included as an Indian, and they told her no, she became a white woman. And then the Indian Act was amended in 1985 to bring it in line with the charter. And that was when I started to realize that, oh, maybe I can do something about my father and my grandmother not being registered as a status Indian. So I started doing my family oral research in 1985, and that took me about 9 years. And then eventually in 1994, I applied for Indian status, but I was denied because of an unknown paternal grandfather. And that was pretty annoying because, I thought that the Indian Act was amended to bring it in line with the charter. And to me, that was sex discrimination to deny me something because of an unknown grandfather. And so we moved forward. I found a lawyer and we moved forward and filed a statement of claim in 2001. But the first one was struck. And then we filed the second statement of claim in 2002. And then it took 13 years where finally my court case was heard in the Ontario Superior Court. But unfortunately, I lost because of really pitiful reasoning. The justice argued that my application was treated the same way as a man's application. She didn't even consider the fact that if my ancestry came down a man line, I would be a status Indian, but because it came down my grandmother line, I was denied. That wasn't even considered in the process. So it was really pitiful. We went to the Court of Appeal in December of 2016. And during that process, we realized that the Department of Justice failed. They actually failed to disclose all the evidence. And that was an intentional strategy of denial. And then in April 2017, the Court of Appeal did grant me Indian status, but not through charter law. They relied on administrative law, and they granted me a lesser form of status, 6-2 status, which meant that I couldn't pass it on to my nephews and nieces, for example. So I had to plow forward and rally behind Sharon McGyver, who was at the United Nations level addressing what's known as the 6-1A, 6-1C hierarchy. And she was at the United Nations level for 9 years, where it was ruled that Canada had to eliminate all the sex discrimination once and for all. And then in October 2019, finally, I was upgraded from the lesser form of Indian status to 6-1A.3. So did you get all that?
I think so. They were paying close attention here in the audience, Lynn. Thank you for setting that up. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into some of these momentous pivotal dates and exactly the case that you have fought and won. So stand by. SAMRA, your story, very different, but also epic, long, and international. Can you please tell us the story that you have presented in this book, A Good Wife?
Absolutely. And first, I want to thank Lynn for sharing that, and it's so incredibly inspiring. So honored to share the stage with you, Lynn. So before I get into my story, I just want to ask the audience, everybody here, close your eyes for a few minutes. Just humor me, just for a few seconds, okay? And imagine that you're in a confined, dark place. Maybe a box, trapped. And there's enough air in that box that you can breathe and survive, but not enough for you to be able to breathe deeply and freely. So you're like in a state of constant suffocation, just gasping for air, trying to stay afloat. It's a horrible feeling, isn't it? And that is the feeling of being trapped in a cycle of abuse. You can open your eyes now, thank you. And that was my life for a very, very long time. In many ways, even before my marriage started. Because I grew up in a family where it was a very confusing upbringing. On one hand, great, you're getting 100% on tests, congratulations. And on the other hand, don't dream too big, because don't forget that you're a girl. Your ultimate destiny is to be in servitude to a man. Don't expect these dreams to come true. So growing up, I never really thought that I had any major freedoms, but at the same time, I was always a rebel, so I pushed the envelope in my own ways, started a girls' cricket team in my school, and started a school newspaper to share all my radical ideas of gender equality, and labeled a bit of a weirdo a lot of times, but still being very defiant in whatever ways I could. So at the age of 16, when my mom came into my room, and as I was doing my math homework, I was in grade 11, she put a glass of orange juice on the table, stroked my hair lovingly, and announced to me that there is a marriage proposal, and in a few months I'd be getting married to this man who I had never met before, who was 12 years older, lived in this faraway country called Canada, and then I arrived here as this man's teen bride. And became a teenage mom, didn't have any clue about my rights as a woman, as a human being, as a Canadian, didn't have any clue about my autonomy, about my rights over myself, over my body, over my own being. And in many ways feeling very powerless and helpless. And this book is the journey of escaping that box, escaping that life, and finding not just a better life for myself and my daughters, but also finding myself. So I'm going to read a couple of passages, very short, and I picked these passages because they really show that contrast between my life during that time and right after. So the first passage is, this was in the first few years of my marriage, and the only place that I was allowed to go, to step out of the house and allowed to go, was the neighborhood Ontario Lear Center. And I would take my daughter there, who was a year and a half or 2 years at the time, and I would sometimes coming back or going there, I would hide under a bridge that was on the way, and I would take off my hijab and just feel the air in my hair and experience those few seconds of freedom, and they were so precious to me. And this passage is from a time when I was coming back, when I was walking back from the Ontario Lears, and there was my daughter started asking for a sprinkles donut. She saw Tim Hortons on the way, so here goes. It was another short delay in my return home from the drop-in center. A quick stop at Tim Hortons to get a donut with sprinkles for Aisha. I stood at the counter after ordering and dug into my coat pocket to retrieve the toonie I was sure was there, but I couldn't find it. I stepped back from the counter, searching all of my other pockets and then turning my attention to the diaper bag. My embarrassment was ratcheting into panic. Even as I anxiously worked my way through the bag, I knew my search was fruitless. I never had any money on me. I had a bank account, which I'd been required to open when we got the mortgage, but it sat empty. I'd managed to buy myself only a few toiletries with money that my father had wired to me for my birthday before Ahmed transferred everything into his own account. And he gave me no money to spend of my own. If we were out shopping and I needed to buy something, he would often hand me a few dollars and say, "Why do you need money? It's not like you go anywhere without me." He had been right, of course, but every once in a while, I tried to squirrel away a few coins, like the one I thought was resting in my coat pocket. I had moved the stroller away from the counter and was getting ready to slink out of the store when I heard a voice. "Excuse me, can I buy you a coffee?" I looked up. A white man in his early 30s was standing before me. He was pointing to the counter. "No, thank you," I said, mortified. I don't want coffee." All the things Ahmed had told me about men were beating through my mind. Why was the man doing this? Was this some way to get me alone? To attack me? "What did you order then?" the man asked. I glanced quickly at his face. His eyes were kind and soft, and his tone was sympathetic, not coercive. He felt sorry for me. "A donut," I said weakly, glancing down at the stroller. The man smiled at Aisha. "Let me get that for her." I protested, but he put the money down on the counter and handed me the bag with the donut. "Have a nice afternoon," he said, as he headed out the door. I watched him get in his car and exit the parking lot. Then I pushed the stroller outside. Sitting on a dusty bench, feeding small pieces of donut to Aisha, tears overtook me. I wanted to be grateful for the man's generosity, but all I felt was stinging humiliation. What kind of life was I living that I didn't even have $2 on me? And what kind of person I was that people took such pity on me? The answer was obvious. I was poor, I was powerless, I was pathetic. And, sorry, I knew that was going to be a bit emotional. The next passage is towards the end of the book, when I had escaped the marriage. I had been living on campus housing. I was about to finish my undergraduate degree. And my department of economics, where I was doing my undergrad, they nominated me for this really big award at the University of Toronto, which is the top scholarship that goes to only one person out of all 3 campuses at the U of T every year. And I had made it to the final round, and this was my interview. So the finalists were all interviewed in front of a panel. The interview took place at the main campus in downtown Toronto. I arrived a full hour early, finding a spot to park the minivan. It was the first week of February, and as soon as I turned off the engine, cold air began to seep into the car. I sat behind the steering wheel, shivering, trying to calm my nerves. I had a copy of my personal statement in my purse. I took it out and read it. Then I read it again and again. I was trying to beat back the needles of doubt. I was trying to remind myself of who I was now and who I wanted to be. Eventually, I got out of the car and walked towards the interview room. A few minutes later, I was taking a seat at a large square conference table in an elegant window-lined room. I looked at the 10 awards committee members facing me. Their expressions were friendly, and John Rothschild, the chair of the committee, started the interview with some generous words about my academic record, which helped me breathe a bit easier. One of the first questions was what leadership meant to me. I had been a TA and I had run some classes and groups at the local women's organization, but these were not the experiences I wanted to stress. Instead, I told them that I thought the most powerful type of leadership was leading by example. As a mother, I was striving to do that. I wanted my daughters to know that they had every right to pursue every opportunity in the world. One of the next questions made me pause. Who is the person who has taught you the most? Who has been the most influential? I was about to say my father, but I stopped myself. If I were being honest, I had to admit that wasn't true. I took a deep breath and I forced myself to answer. My ex-husband, I said. I glanced around the table. Face after face registered shock and disbelief. In my personal statement, I had mentioned briefly that it had taken me years of struggle to get to university because I had been wed as a teen and I was stuck in an abusive marriage. My answer had clearly struck everyone as bizarre. My husband taught me how not to treat people, I explained. He showed me what I didn't want to become. In a way, he taught me how to be strong because he forced me to be strong. Because of what he put me through, what I had to rise above, I learned what I was capable of. While I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone else, I might never have known the truth of my strength or discovered its dimensions if he had not driven me to it. The final question, however, was the one that unnerved me. With everything that you've faced, what is it that keeps you going? The cool professional facade I'd been trying to maintain through the long round of questions started to crumble. I could feel my throat constrict. When I started to speak, my voice was wobbly. Every day I feel like I should give up, I admitted. But every day I make myself get up and keep going. I need to respect myself and my dreams, to live with dignity and freedom. But it's more than that. I keep going because of my daughters. I want things to be easier for them. I want them to be able to pursue their goals and their dreams. Everyone should have the right to do that. With that, I thank the judges for their time and for the opportunity that they had given me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Just
I did end up winning the award, by the way.
I was just going to ask to make sure. And that was a big award. That was a big award. Thank you for that, for the bookends of that story. And we're going to dig in a little bit more shortly, because I do want to hear more about the role your parents played in setting you on a very difficult path, one that you emerged triumphant, but there were a lot of challenges. So we'll come back to that in a second. Lynn, as we begin to unpack your epic journey against the Canadian government, you touched on the 1985 amendment to the Indian Act. And if I understand this correctly, it was amended to conform to Section 15 of the Charter, which prevents discrimination on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So the Indian Act was amended in order to conform to that. So on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But in fact, it was a very not good thing. Lynn, could you explain exactly what happened there that helped set the stage for your fight?
Sure. So as you said, in 1985, the Indian Act was amended to bring it in line with the Charter, in particular Section 15. And what ended up happening was through the process, Canada crafted additional sex discrimination, and that very much was intentional and very much was a strategy on the part of the state. They used legislative reform as an opportunity to obfuscate and hide and disguise sex discrimination and begin a process of litigating against children. A lot of people have a hard time understanding that, but prior to 1985, there was a clause in the Indian Act that protected children of unknown and unstated paternity. And then in 1985, they took that clause out and became silent. So the legislation was silent on that very issue. And then at the level of policy and practice within the Department of Indian Affairs, they started to make the assumption that those children of unknown and unstated paternity, the man was a white man, which of course meant that the children were denied Indian status registration. So not only did they do that for the births after 1985, but with the women who were reinstated, they started to apply this new policy in a retroactive way. And this is, of course, really problematic because there's a lot of young girls, 13, 14, 15, who are getting pregnant by men who are married, for example, through the process of rape, for example, and the fathers will not sign these birth certificates. So these young women who don't even have the legal right to consent to sex were then being discriminated against by Indian Affairs. And of course, as I said, they were litigating against children. So that's what happened with me when I went through the process of getting Indian status, applying in 1994. I didn't know what they were going to do with the unknown grandfather that I have, a paternal grandfather. And to me, it was like, wow, I wonder what they're going to do. And I was a little floored when they determined that I wasn't entitled to Indian status registration because of that. And that's when I started the process of litigating.
So tell us a bit more about that, because there's quite a difference between someone who feels they have been wronged by the government, by the state, and then somebody who decides they're just going to challenge that and they're going to do whatever it takes, that being you. Where did that come from in your own soul, that you thought you were ready for this fight? Tell us a bit more about the decision to take on the government.
Well, I'm an Algonquin Anishinaabe Kwe, and I come from Pikwakanagan First Nation. My great-grandmother comes from there, but because of the sex discrimination, she was told to leave. And so she was told to leave because of a white man in her ancestry. And not only was she told to leave, along with my grandmother, we were told we couldn't have any land because we were Indians. So we couldn't be status Indians, we couldn't live on the reserve, and then we were also denied land because we're Indians. So where does that come from? It just comes from probably the need to construct meaning from the incredible loss and genocide that Canada has done to Indigenous people and continues to do to Indigenous people.
Thank you, Lynn, for that. You know, SAMRA, when we talk about family and culture and the influence, obviously, on all of us, you know, your parents played a significant role in putting you on this very difficult path. So can you just talk a bit more about that, and maybe also how you reconcile your relationship with your parents looking back now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Lucy. You know, when you talk about abuse and patriarchy and sexism and all these things, it's not something that anyone is born with. It's learned behavior, whether it's inflicting abuse, whether it's tolerating abuse, whether it's putting up with it, staying silent about it. It's learned. It's conditioned from a very, very young age. And growing up in that kind of environment where, first of all, like I described in the beginning, that confusion of where my boundaries lie, what is that box that I'm trying to fit into, and that is sort of the only way as a girl I will be accepted and respected and loved. And then growing up, when I became a teenager and just witnessing the relationship between my own parents. My father was an abuser. My mother put up with it. Everybody around said, this is normal, this is okay. So when that same thing happened in my own marriage, it was very much just a continuation of the same. And then I was expected to be silent, conform, tolerate, be submissive, because that's what was expected of me. Women don't speak up, women don't leave. I remember my mother telling me a story that when she once tried to leave her marriage to my father, her family completely told her not to ever even think about it, no matter what happens, even if he kills you. And my mother would say that, I was not able to leave because of that, because of my family didn't support me. But then when I tried to leave, I was also sent back the same way. That no, you should stay and make it work. Maybe he's going to learn his lesson now that you've tried to leave once. And eventually, it took me 5 or 6 times to be able to finally walk away from that, and not just walk away, but then I had to cut ties with a lot of people from my childhood. My father had already been dead for a long time when I left my marriage, but my mother's alive, and it's been a very, very confusing and tumultuous relationship with her. There were several years when I just had no contact with her because I was judged and made to feel bad about myself every time I talked to her because of the choices that I've made in my life. And I didn't want that continuation to happen with my own daughters. And now that I do have some kind of a relationship with her, it's on my terms and with very, very firm boundaries, because I don't want that toxicity to influence the way I feel not just about myself, but also the kind of environment that I'm creating and the kind of upbringing that I'm creating for my girls. So it's very hard to do that because, when it comes to family, like when we are growing up as children, the biggest thing we want is the approval of our parents and love from our parents. And we sort of grow up looking for that all the time. And it takes a ton of courage, a ton of self-doubt to overcome, and very difficult moments and reconciliation with ourselves to unlearn that seeking of approval that we grow up with. So it's been a very painful journey, but also a very necessary journey.
When, though, I can't help but think that when you were told over and over, whether in your marriage, perhaps the messages you get at home that you're worthless, you're sinful, the things that you do, I can't help but imagine you would internalize something like that. So unlearning that must be a major journey. And how do you unlearn it and not at the same time pass those messages on to your 2 daughters? How did you do that?
It's absolutely you'd internalize it. I lived so long believing in my core that there is something inherently wrong with me, that I'm broken, abnormal, unworthy, undeserving of respect and love. In fact, even when I started university, after 10 years of struggle and working through my high school courses through distance learning and then running a babysitting service to save the money that I needed for my first year tuition fee as a part-time student. So I had been married for almost 10 years and I had 2 children by the time I was able to start university. And I was given very strict instructions by my husband at the time that don't talk to anyone in class, don't make any friends, don't raise your hand. In other words, be invisible, because the biggest tool abusers use to control their victims is isolation. So he wanted me to be as isolated as possible because then it would be easier to control me. So in the beginning, I would try not to engage with anyone. First of all, I thought that he had spies on campus watching me who are going to report back to him. But beyond that, it was because inherently I felt that I'm so unworthy of connection that sooner or later, if I try to talk to someone, they'll figure out that I'm so damaged and dirty inside that they will just disengage with me anyway. So why bother? And that fear of rejection and humiliation is what kept me from engaging with anybody, in my peers, in my classes, even with my professors. I was very academically inclined. I've always been. So there was this one time, it was my first midterm for that. I was only allowed to take 1 course in my first semester, Economics 100, and I got 100% on that first midterm, and the professor decided to announce the names of the students who got 100 in front of the class. So when he announced my name, and everybody, when someone announces the name, and then everyone's like looking around, who is this SAMRA person? And I'm just sitting in the corner, wishing that there would be a hole that would open up, and I would just, fall in it because I didn't want people to see me, and not because, again, not because he would find out, but more because they would find out who I am and how unworthy I am. So that it gets internalized, because if somebody is telling you every single day that the reason you're being disrespected and humiliated is because you deserve it, it's your fault, it's very difficult to overcome that, and it's very difficult to not internalize it. So but here I was being treated with kindness and respect at school for the very first time in my life for the things that I was always ridiculed for: my intelligence, my goals, my ambitions, my dreams, and my individuality. And then I would go home and I would be treated like the scum stuck at the bottom of someone's shoe. And I would be like, so who am I? Am I this rock star, or am I this person who doesn't deserve any amount of respect? And one day, lost in these thoughts, I was walking on campus and I came across this sign outside the Health and Counseling Center that had a bunch of questions on it. Do you feel like you don't have a voice? Do you feel intimidated? Do you feel like you're living in fear? It was as if that sign was calling out to me. And I went in and I made an appointment, and that's when I first started to talk to somebody who was not from my family, who was not telling me to go back. And when I was starting at the first session with my counselor, the floodgates opened, and I started to say things like, please tell me what's wrong with me. What is the secret to being a good wife that keeps eluding me? How do I do better? Do I cook better food, or wash better clothes, or keep the baby quieter at night, or not talk too much, or not have opinions, or not share opinions? Should I give up my education? Like, what can I do to be on that pedestal, because I just can't be good enough? And that's the first time anyone said to me, Samra, it's not your fault. You do not deserve to be treated this way. No one does. That's the first time I heard the word abuse. And that's when I started to read about abuse and learn, and my counselor would give me articles and books to read, etc. It still took another 2 years to get to a place of really believing it wasn't my fault, and learning about my rights and my legal rights and as human rights, and being able to walk away, because abuse is insidious. It's not just about a slap or a kick. It's like this death by 1,000 cuts. It's like, you put a frog in cold water and you put the heat up ever so slightly, and the water will keep heating up, and the frog's body temperature will keep adjusting to the rising temperature of the water, and the frog will one day eventually boil to death without even realizing it. And that's what abuse is like. It doesn't start off with a slap or a kick. It starts off in very insidious ways and progresses. And in my marriage, it was 10 years that it kept happening.
Yeah. And you talk about that so powerfully in your book. I hope you'll all get a copy. And also of Lynn's. Lynn, you go back and talk about, and you mentioned off the top, your great-grandfather, Joseph Gagnon. And then the letter that your great-grandmother got saying that she was a white woman. You have a story, part of your book, that you want to read for us, that sort of outlines that story a bit. Can you tell us that part?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to first say to Samra that my abuser has been the Canadian nation state. That's my primary abuser, and they continue today abuse Indigenous people. And as an Algonquin, they are doing a particular kind of abuse to the Algonquin people. So I first want to begin by honoring Chief Greg Saracen, who argued that the Algonquin Nation was never a newcomer to its territory. Our occupation and use of an identifiable tract of land goes beyond the limits of what is now called history. The Algonquin have lived in the valley of the Ottawa River at least as long as the French have lived in France and the English have lived in England. So, it is correct that at contact this was Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. It's not just our ancient territory, it is our contemporary territory. We've never extinguished our rights to our territory. So in my book, I'm going to read from chapter 1. It's titled Fighting for Recognition. I'm going to read 4 small paragraphs. Yes, I'm going to tell the story about my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother when they became white people and lost everything. So my great-grandfather, Joseph Gagnon, served in the First World War. On September 12, 1910, in Eganville, Ontario, Joseph married Algonquin Anishinaabe Annie Jane Manasse. Joseph and Annie Jane were members of the Golden Lake Indian Reserve, now called Pikwakanagan First Nation, raising their 5 children, Viola, Cecilia, Gordon, Kenneth, and Steve. Viola, their first child, was my Kokomas. After the war ended, Joseph returned to his family and home community of the Golden Lake Indian Reserve. From my family oral history, I've learned that shortly after, in the 1920s or early 30s, the RCMP escorted him and his family out of their community because his Indigenous identity was borne by his mother and sister line rather than his father. The indigeneity of his wife, Annie Jane, was irrelevant because women, according to British law, were mere appendages of their fathers and husbands. Apparently, this practice was commonly imposed on Indigenous veterans and their families families when they came home from serving the British Crown. As the British Crown loyal allies, some lost all their treaty rights as Indigenous people. Well, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe are the traditional Indigenous landholders of the Ottawa River Valley. Through colonial practices, policies, and laws, many of us were and remain denied the right to pass on to our families our national identity and our rights as Indigenous people, such as the right to own land and resources, and via this, the right to live Minnebamonsalin. Rather, as historians have argued, we were stripped of our national identity, and many were relegated to living in reserved communities until we could prove we met the British criteria of what it meant to be civilized. The reason for this was that British Canada did not view the Algonquin people as real people, but rather as pre-human beings without legitimate identity, culture, or governance tradition. Consequently, we also lacked a valid holding on the land. In concrete terms, the legacy of these colonial policies and laws also manifests today in the intergenerational transfer of land holdings in the form of what is and what is not willed to children and grandchildren of settler families and Indigenous families. The short story is that many settler families continue to benefit from Indigenous land and the denial of our land rights. In this way, settler Canadians, you should know that my great-grandfather Joseph went to war for your rights, not mine.
Very, very true, very powerful. Yeah, go ahead and applaud. You know, Lynn, setback after setback legally over the course of your fight against the Canadian government. Then finally, I want you to talk about the summer of 2019. Setting the stage, there was a looming election. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry released its final report. The issue around Jody Wilson-Raybould and the Prime Minister was also swirling in the news. And all of a sudden, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decides to take action. What happened?
Exactly. You know, Indigenous women have been trying to get Canada to remove the sex discrimination in the Indian Act since the 1960s. You know, with Mary Two-Axe Early and Yvonne Bedard and Jeanette Laval and Senator Sandra Lovelace and Sharon McIver and myself. We had tried since the 1960s, and there was three failed remedial legislations. With Bill C-31, Bill C-3, and Bill S-3, they absolutely failed to eliminate all the sex discrimination, and there's no excuse for that. It was very much an intentional strategy. It wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't until. And the story I'm going to tell you right now, but you can get more out of the book. It wasn't until Justin Trudeau was up against a couple of ethics scandals that he finally stepped up and eliminated all the sex discrimination in the Indian Act and met the 618 all the way concept and clause. So he was able to do what no other prime minister was able to do for over the last 50 years. And you know, I think deeply about that, it's really, and I'm thinking about Indigenous agency and political change, I think it's pretty pitiful. That's a really useful Anishinaabe word. It's really pitiful that we have to wait until a prime minister is under kind of a strict review and criticism for ethics issues, that then we are able to get him to act because he's in need of being loved or liked. Right? It's really kind of sad that that's the only way that it happened, or one of the big ways. Certainly Sharon McIver going to the United Nations for 10 years was a huge, huge thing, but he was still reluctant to address the sex discrimination. It was a constant thing we had to do.
Yeah, you make a good point, and a lot of people were nodding and agreeing very much with what you're saying there. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions before we take our intermission. But Lynn, also, I wanted to just wrap it up with your great-grandfather. That same summer, 2019, you were asked to go to a ceremony in your community of Pikwakagagan. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Pikwakagagan. To claim Joseph Gagne's medals from World War I. And that must have been like such a moving time for you. This is where it all started for you. You were asked to go and claim his medals. Can you just briefly tell us that story as a bookend to that summer of 2019?
So, Pikwakanagan First Nation. Pikwakanagan First Nation. That's probably a good reconciliation task for everybody on Algonquin territory, to learn the First Nations names and how to pronounce them. It's really important. It'll bring it into your consciousness better. I struggled with that as well, and I broke it down to Pikwakanagan. One time I actually made a song in order to remember a name. So your question, Lucy, I'm gonna have to correct you. I did not go there to pick up his war medals. I went there to engage in a celebration. I was invited by Chief Wendy Jocko, and I still am so grateful for that invitation to come to Pikwakanagan and celebrate the World War veterans. One of them was my great grandfather, Joseph Garnier, and I also received, on behalf of him, my family, a medal for his effort. It was a smaller medal, and I'm not allowed to wear it. But I was able to wear it on that day and pin it on my dress. I bought a new dress and dance with it. I danced with it, which was totally amazing for me. It was a little bit hard, though, because I do have a vision disability, and I danced with my two cousins beside me. And I kept bumping into them as I was dancing.
Wonderful story, and it just ties it back to him and to you and all the work that you had done. I just think it's a wonderful tale that you tell in the book. Samra, maybe I could ask you one more question before we head into intermission. Sure. One of the things that struck me in the book as well, after getting to know so much about your ex-husband Ahmed, how abusive he was, how a long list of abusive tendencies and characteristics. You say in the book that it was important to you to facilitate a relationship between him and your daughters. Now, why was that important to you, and what happened?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking, Lucy. And again, when I was talking about the conditioning, and the conditioning that I grew up with was that parents can do no wrong. And no matter what, parents are supposed to be in your life, you're supposed to be obedient, et cetera, et cetera. So even though, I had taken that step to leave my marriage, it took me, since then, it's been now 11 or 12 years since I've left my marriage. And I'm still on that journey of unlearning those conditioning beliefs, and this is something I'm actively writing about now. But in those early years after separation, I was still trying to facilitate some sort of a relationship between him and my girls, because in my head, yes, he's abusive to me, but he was not a bad father, and they should have their father in their lives, and they deserve to have their father in their lives. And my daughter, who at the time was 15, taught me a very important lesson. I know we shared this story backstage. She said to me, "Mom, tell me something. If he wasn't my dad, if he was just some random guy that we knew, like an acquaintance, right? And the kind of person he is, he's an abuser. He's misogynist, he's a racist, he's a homophobic, he is all kinds of these things, all the values that we stand against. Would you really want someone like that in my life as a role model?" I was like, no. And she's like, "So why does he get a free pass?" And I was like, all right, lesson learned. I'm not going to push anymore. And since then, my daughters have both decided that they do not want him in their lives, and if they ever choose to, they will decide on what terms and how much, if at all. And I fully, wholeheartedly support them in their decision. And I think it's been a very big learning curve for me with my own mom as well, because in the beginning, after my marriage ended, even though she had, treated me badly, she pushed me into the marriage. There were so many elements of guilt and shame that I had to work through to be able to draw those boundaries with her. And again, from that conditioning of like, she's my mother, I'm supposed to have her in my life, and I'm supposed to be that obedient, compliant girl. And, I know she did something bad to me, but she's my mom after all. And it took me a while to learn to love myself enough to know that even though she is my parent, she doesn't bring acceptance and love into my life. So it's okay to draw those boundaries. And I think just as an extension of that, that has translated to even some of the cultural elements of what I grew up with, because the backlash that I faced when I started sharing my story was tremendous. I had known when I walked away from my marriage, at that time I had no intentions of ever going public with my story. But I had kind of anticipated that, yes, I'm going to face some challenges as I go on embarking on this new life. But I had no idea how bad it would be. The backlash and the way I was called names, the sexual harassment I faced because I had done something sinful and shameful, and I was damaged goods, and all those kinds of connotations that come with being a divorced woman in the culture and community that I grew up with. So it was a very difficult journey, and I think that's what gave me the courage eventually to speak, because when I got academic success, and I read a passage in the beginning about that, I was asked to share my story by my friend's mom. So my friend's mom used to write this online blog for a major Pakistani online newspaper. And she came to me on my graduation day when I won the top student award, and she said, I'd love to talk about your story, Samra. And I was like, no way, no, it's too shameful. And then again, my daughters are like something else. So she says to me, Mom, if every woman thinks it's so shameful and we shouldn't talk about it, then how will this ever change? I think you should talk about it. So I shared my story, and yes, I got a ton of support. And the story first went live on my convocation day, and I came home and I logged into my social media. It was flooded with thousands of messages of support and thanks and congratulations. But then there were also messages of hate and of judgment, and lots of vitriol, because I was standing against principles that people believed in, which helped them live these lives of lies and abuse and patriarchy and all those things that I was now threatening, and they didn't want to be threatened. So it's taken, that journey has in itself taken another long time to be okay with. Okay, you know what? This is not about me. They don't even know me. So it's not that this backlash is towards me. It's about what I stand for. And instead of now being hurt and feeling rejected over it, I use it as more fuel to my fire. Because until these attitudes exist, the work needs to continue to be done.
Excellent. Great. Awesome. Thank you, Samra. And how about these two girls that she's raising? How about a round of applause for those two? Terrific. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, go get some refreshments, and then we will be back for your questions. So give some thought to that, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lynn. We'll see you in a bit. I think we're just rounding up the last folks out in the lobby, and we'll get started. Have you thought of some great questions? We're going to take questions for about 15 or 20. Maybe while you're getting settled and sorted, I'll throw the first one out in this part again. Lynn, maybe we can start with you. I was watching Lynn be interviewed earlier this week, and one of the questions that came in was by a man who many of you may know, named Veldon Coburn. And he's an academic, he's very thoughtful, he's a friend of Lynn's. And one of the questions that didn't get to, so I'm borrowing his question, Lynn, it has to do with pretendians and cultural appropriation. Here you are fighting so hard for status, And lately, we have seen more and more stories of people who have just gone in and pretended to be Indigenous people. Can you just speak about your thoughts on that?
Sure, but first I want to say that the Algonquin own the territory in the Ottawa River watershed, which is 45 million acres. That's our traditional territory. It spans both Quebec and Ontario, and we've been divided by language, religion, and law. And what people may want to know is that Long Point First Nation, there's 10 Algonquin First Nations in Quebec. I think it's 10 or maybe 9. No, there's 9. Long Point First Nation, they don't even have a land base. And as a matter of fact, when you total up the land base that our reserves are, it's only around 60,000 acres out of 48 million acres. So that's really important to keep in mind, that colonization continues and genocide continues. The issue of pretend Indians is huge. I have never had the privilege of meeting Veldin. He's apparently a cousin. You know, that's one thing about Indigenous people. We know who our cousins are. But I do really value Veldin, and I'm so happy he's out there doing his critical thinking. So, for example, he talks about the fact that Canada can produce and can create an Algonquin province versus force us to extinguish our land. And I think that's really brilliant. That's the smartest thing I've heard in a long time. But the issue of pretend Indians is an obfuscation of what's going on. It seems like identity is obfuscating the genocide and the colonization process, especially for the Algonquins. So we have Queen's University has been called out for pretend Indians, and they're not doing anything about it. Probably has to do with money. Recently, Carrie Barassa from the University of Saskatchewan has been called out as a pretend Indian. And it's just horrible when you think about how these people who are not Indigenous are going into the universities and usurping positions and resources and producing knowledge that they claim is Indigenous knowledge. And it isn't Indigenous knowledge. We have to have the right to produce our own knowledge from our own people. So the pretend Indian issues in the university is huge. In the Algonquin land claim process in Ontario, so unfortunately the Algonquins were denied a treaty during the historic treaty process, which makes no sense at all, because Parliament Hill is on Algonquin land, the Supreme Court of Canada is on Algonquin land, the Government General's House is on Algonquin land, Wakefield is on Algonquin land, yet we were denied a treaty during the historic treaty process, and that's because the British had a particular kind of genocide in mind for the Algonquin people. They have divided us by through the provincial federal order. And currently, right now, what is happening is the land claim process. A lot of people don't understand the difference between a land claim process and a modern treaty process, which is the rhetoric that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau uses. A treaty is sharing land and resources equally, whereas a land claim forces people like the Algonquins to extinguish our land rights. Well, in the Algonquin of Ontario land claim process, not only have we been divided by our relatives on the other side of the river, but we have a real infestation, I'm going to use the word infestation, of fake Algonquin people, pretend Indians, and race shifters. So race shifters are people who go back to the 1600s and pick up an Indigenous ancestor and suddenly become Algonquin. And not only that, we have actually pretend Indians, people who have absolutely zero ancestry, even from the 16 or 1700s. And they're using fraudulent documents to claim that they're Algonquin and be enrolled in the Algonquin land claim and self-government process. So, for example, CBC has done some really, really good work on this topic of pretend Indians, and the issue of the Lagarde line and the carrier line, and Veldin has worked hard on this as well. There was as many as 2,000 pretend Algonquins. And why that is really, really problematic is because the Algonquins in Ontario, there's only 8,000 of us. So if we have 2,000 people who aren't Algonquin voting on our AIP, which they did, then that means that we could have these pretend Indians committing genocide.
Thank you, Lynn, and appreciate that. response. I have tons more questions, but I know you have questions. So here's one here, and Hélène will come up with the microphone if you want to tell us who your question's for and what it is.
My question is for SAMRA, and I must say I was hesitant to ask it, but I first asked you in the break. Thank you for suggesting. So I think we do have a lot of reckoning to do in Canada, of course, and I think that part of that reckoning, as Michel Jean said on Friday night, is to, he said in truth and reconciliation, first there's truth and then there's reconciliation. So you talked about your story, and there's something that I believe is objectively, that we can all recognize as objectively true. Abuse is morally wrong, right? That's a universal, it's a truism, right? And I wanted to hear your thoughts on, because at the root of your story, there's forced marriage or arranged marriage, right? And I wanted to hear you, on is forced marriage objectively morally wrong, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. Sometimes people get confused between forced marriage, arranged marriage, child marriage. So just quickly define those three things, and I'll share some of my thoughts. So an arranged marriage is mom playing Tinder, right? And if you're an adult and you are of complete consciousness and independent thought, and for some reason, which again, I would never, but if for some reason, let's say you were to go to your parents and say, find someone for me, and I have friends who've done that, great, that works for you, right? If it's coming from a place of conscious, independent thought and choice. Forced marriage, and people think force is like a gun to your head or a knife to your throat, but force hardly ever manifests like that. Force is coercion, pressure, to conform, to comply. And if you read my book, or if you do read my book, you'll notice how I've described that insidious way of conforming and pressure, that this is God's will. If you say no, then you'll earn the wrath of God, or you'll earn the wrath of your parents. You're so lucky to get this marriage proposal and be the first girl among all of your cousins to get married. So as a child, what's a child going to do? Right? They're not going to disappoint their parents. And I talked about how, as children, we all want to win the approval and acceptance of our parents, right? So force, and that could happen to adults as well. A lot of adults go through that pressure to conform and comply, etc. So that is absolutely, unequivocally wrong. And then there comes child marriage. And child marriage is a minor being pressured, like I was. And at that point, it is always forced, because no child should ever even be put into that position, right? No child is even capable. I'm now a medical student. We talk a lot about capacity, and how can somebody make an informed decision if they don't have the capacity to make that decision? No child has the capacity to make a sound, independent, conscious decision about marriage. Right? A lot of adults don't have the capacity to make that decision, let alone children. So when you think about child marriage, it is, the words are sometimes, child marriage, oh yeah, it happens somewhere in Africa, it happens somewhere in other countries in the world. It happens everywhere. There are 12 million girls every single year around the world pushed into child marriage. There are 700 million women alive today who were child brides. I'm one of them. And it doesn't just happen in faraway countries. Child marriage, shockingly, and a lot of you might be shocked hearing this, is legal in Canada. In Canada, the minimum age of marriage is 16 with parental consent. Up until a few years ago, it was actually 14 with parental consent. So think about this. A girl under 18, right, cannot vote, cannot buy alcohol, cannot get a credit card, cannot buy property, but she can be forced into the most important legal contract of her life, all with the signature of a parent or legal guardian. And when people think about child marriage, they think, oh, it's, two 16-year-olds, high school sweethearts trying to get married. Actually, it's not that. McGill University recently came out with a study last year. There have been almost 4,000 marriage licenses issued in every province in Canada, marrying underage girls with older men. 94% of these 4,000 were underage girls with older men. Some of the extreme cases were like a 16-year-old girl with a 51-year-old man in New Brunswick. And it happens in all provinces. It happens in our backyards and neighborhoods. Since I've written this book, I have gone across the country and done hundreds and hundreds of book clubs, taken part and talked to teachers and parents and whatnot, done TED Talks, and I cannot even tell you the amount of stories I've heard from school guidance counselors and teachers and relatives of how prevalent it is in our neighborhoods. One quick story, a teacher in Cambridge, Ontario told me that there's a girl in her grade 11 class, and every so often, a new man's family would come to their home to sort of size her up as an eligible bride for their son. And the girl's own mother would make her vacuum in front of these families so the families can see she can vacuum in straight lines, so she's good wife material. And this girl is born and raised in Ontario, in Canada. So this is happening here. And why does this propagate? Because people from outside of those communities are too afraid to talk about it because they don't want to be labeled as racists. People from within those communities are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to be shunned and rejected and labeled as, oh, you're, like I get labeled all the time, you're just using your story and defaming your culture and religion for self-promotion and to become famous. Right? And then there's this culture of silence in the name of so-called honor that keeps going. And silence never helps the oppressed. It always helps the oppressor. And silence is the biggest ally of abuse. And abuse can be in various forms: domestic abuse, or child marriage, or forced marriage, or any other kind of harassment, so to speak, any form of patriarchy and abuse. Silence is the biggest ally. And that's why these things continue, and the victims are the people who are trapped in that silence. So until that silence is broken and those voices are, and people develop the courage to actually call it out for what it is, we're just going to keep doing damage control forever.
That is horrifying to think that there are that many still happening in this country. In this country.
And just one quick second, and that number, sorry, I get too passionate about this. That number of 4,000 doesn't even include the children brought into the country as child brides, like myself, or the ones who are like taken back home during summer vacation to be pushed into marriage. So much, very, very, or even the marriages that are happening in the mosques and the synagogues and whatnot and not being registered in the legal system. So that number, again, is very underreported.
Okay, but definitely more stories need to be done on that. Wow, thank you for that. Who else has a question? Ellen, you've got one from online, okay?
There are a number of questions online. I'll ask this one of Lynn. Question for Lynn. I heard you say that the Department of Justice failed to disclose evidence in Gehl versus Canada. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Again, I just want to start by pointing out that it was in 1839 when British Canada declared all Indigenous land Crown land. And in 1853, through the Public Lands Act, they gave free lands available to European settlers, but the Algonquins weren't entitled. And in 1868, the Free Grant and Homestead Act, they gave free land to European settlers, but not to Indigenous people. Algonquin people weren't entitled. We were told that we made the adjacent land undesirable. So a lot of people think the Algonquin people sat around and let it happen. And in fact, there was a lot of legislations and policies and laws and practices that took away our land. And the Indian Act continues to eliminate Indians through the second generation cutoff rule. It's really horrible what they're doing there. So what I want to say about the Department of Justice, which has a $500 million budget and probably around 5,000 employees, that's who I was up against, the biggest law firm in Canada, and just me. And I didn't have any money or resources. And as a matter of fact, when I was in my 30s, that's when I started to learn how to read and write. So I had a big, long journey to go along, to take. And what was really a horrible experience for me was that as we were heading toward the Court of Appeal after the pitiful judgment, we discovered that there was some evidence that would have had an impact on my case. But the Department of Justice refused to disclose it. We learned about it because, there was 3 court cases. There was a MacGyver court case and the Deschanel court case and the Gehl court case, going through addressing sex discrimination and the Indian Act. And so we learned about this evidence that the Department of Justice refused to disclose. Finally, we were able to get it, but they just did not want to disclose it. They said it wasn't relevant to the case, but it wasn't up to them to make that decision. The evidence needed to be adjudicated in the Ontario Superior Court. And by the time we went to the Court of Appeal, of course, law is more about power than it is about truth, right? Law is more about power than it is about truth. It's just a methodology which takes out axiology or morals and throws it to the ground. What ended up happening at the Court of Appeal when we wanted to introduce this new evidence, it wasn't even adjudicated because the 3 male judges, ruled on using administrative law. They decided to rule through administrative law versus charter law. And so the issue of the Department of Justice and their corruption and failure to disclose that evidence was never addressed. It was really a sad, unfortunate, miserable day for me.
Thanks, Lynn, for that. Who else has a question here in the room? And if not, we have a question here.
Can I just say that, in Canada, we do have abusers, but the biggest abuser is the nation state called Canada.
As a follow-up to all your hard work, Lynn, I was wondering, how are the numbers now? How many people have been able to benefit from the work that you've done in terms of getting their status back? Any idea?
Thank you for that question. So, I once did a calculation that they probably denied around 60,000 people Indian status registration based on unknown and unstated paternity. I don't know. I don't think that they, delineate that. I don't think I would ever be entitled to that knowledge. I will just say that INAC is lagging in reinstating women and their grandchildren. But I think it's also important for people to understand that what Canada did in the Gehl versus Canada is they grossly narrowed the remedy. So instead of taking a really moral, loving approach to taking care of these children, Canada chose to litigate in a way that hurt them and narrow the remedy. So now what they did is they ruled in Gehl versus Canada, the 3 judges, they said, well, there's some circumstantial evidence. So let's give her Indian status registration based on the circumstantial evidence. What that meant was the court grossly narrowed the potential to really change the lives and improve the lives of a lot of Indigenous children. So, for example, in situations of rape, we never know who the father is, right? You don't know who the father is, right? The women, the Eastern Doorway is the jurisdiction of women, right? You don't always know who the father is. That's just the way it is. But patriarchy has a hard time dealing with the fact that women have jurisdiction of the Eastern Doorway. They just can't handle that because they don't quite understand that natural law rules. And so I can't answer that question, but I do want to stress to you that the core of Gehl versus Canada was not addressed. And that's the nature of what Canada does with these court decisions. And that's not a mistake. It's very much intentional. It's their strategy of genocide.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your question. Are there other questions here in the room before we take another one online? Yeah, we'll take one last one.
This is for SAMRA. SAMRA, and it actually relates to something that Lucy asked you a little earlier, is how do you, screen just moved. What were the characteristics that you feel you had to persevere in your, not your quest, but your ability to keep going and to surmount the challenges that you were faced you?
Thank you for that question. And I do get asked this question, and I sort of, I'm not quite sure how to answer it in a way but I'm going to try. So sometimes, people tend to think that there's some kind of secret ingredient that some people possess in order to be able to go through a lot of difficult circumstances and come out with a healthy perspective, or with the perseverance and resilience. So resilience but I always say resilience is not something that we're born with or not born with. There's no secret ingredient that I have that others don't have. It is something that you cultivate, and it is based on an accumulation of choices that you make in difficult moments. And those difficult moments come in all of our lives. So there's no quantification of trauma. Like, trauma is trauma, adversity is adversity, and it's all relative, right? So people get affected by similar experiences in very different ways because we are very unique. What I think is the key determining factor to how you are able to get out of that difficult experience, whether you become bitter or better, is how you choose to act and how you choose to face that roadblock, whatever that is. And it's like, I call it emotional strength training. When you go to the gym and you do strength training for your physical muscles and for your emotional muscle, it's really about those key moments. And I'll describe some of them. So when I first got married, that was not something that I had a choice about. I came to this country as a teen bride. I didn't even have a choice whether I wanted to be a mom or not. I became a mom at the age of 18. After that, when I was told I can't go to high school anymore because I hadn't even finished my high school when I got married and came here. So I can't go to school because my job now was to stay at home, be a wife, be a daughter-in-law, and be a mom. I had a choice. I could take that. I could say, okay, well, yeah, I know it's heartbreaking, it's terrible this happened to me, but I can't do anything about it, right? And the other choice was try to find out what I can do about it. And my ex-husband one day, when he was in a better mood, I guess, took me to the local high school in Mississauga where we were living, and the principal saw me visibly quite pregnant with this much older looking man, and she put 2 and 2 together, and she's like, not sure if you're going to fit into the student body here, but here's a number you can call. And that number was for the Independent Learning Center, where people can order courses and do their courses at home. When I called them, the person at the other end of the line was like, how old are you? And I'm like, I'm 18. And he's like, so why aren't you in school? And I'm like, it's kind of complicated. And then he goes, well, a lot of students your age who are not in school and who are doing their courses through ILC are students who are in prison for some reason. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of the same here, right? So, and I ordered all my courses through distance learning, through ILC. It took me 5 years to finish my 6 high school credits. I would do all my chores during the day, be the wife and the daughter-in-law and the mom, and then I would go into my room at night with my baby in my lap, and that's where I would study and do my math and economics and all of that. It took me 5 years to finish high school. Many times I had no hope of ever being able to go to university, but I would still, every week, multiple times a week, I would stand in front of a mirror and practice the graduation speech that I would one day deliver. And eventually, after 15 years, I did deliver that speech. So it's those choices, right? Whether you give up or you keep trying. Similarly, when I got into university the first time, I didn't have money to pay for university. I couldn't get OSAP, which is government funding in Ontario, because they look at household income, and he was making good enough income, and I was married, even though I never had a penny on me. So I was like, okay, I don't have money, I can't go to school, I can't get any funding. But I knew I needed to do something to make my own money. Going out of the house and getting a job was not allowed. I wasn't even allowed to step out of the house for any reason. And one day when I was in the grocery store with my mother-in-law, like, you know, when you walk out of the cashiers, and nowadays not so much, but back in those days, there's like, you used to be those bulletin boards with like people selling their couches and TVs, and there was like an ad for babysitting services. And I was like, people can make money doing this? Well, I've got 2 kids, maybe I can give it a shot. And Kijiji was just starting out, and I started placing ads, and I was able to establish a home-based babysitting service. And even though most of my money would be taken away from me every month, I would still stash away $100, $200, whatever I could every month on the side. It took me another 4 years to save up the $2,500 that I needed to pay for my first year tuition fee as a part-time student. And that's when I finally got to university. And after that, those choices again of, do I stay in this marriage now that I've learned that it is abuse and it's not my fault and I have rights? But yeah, my family won't support me, my culture won't support me. Do I stay? Do I just tolerate this because everyone says I should? Or do I want to take that 1% chance that maybe I can make it? And those are the choices you make. And every time you act from that place, it becomes a tiny bit easier, right? Like with the first course I applied through ILC, oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen. The second, yeah, I've done it before, I can do it again, right? And that's how that muscle is built, the resilience muscle that I call, or it's cultivated. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is, yes, I'm afraid, I'm terrified. This may fail, I may fall flat on my face, but I believe in this, I feel strongly about this, so I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And that is, I think, those are the choices that define whether what your life is going to look like and how you're going to get out of it. And there's no such thing as failure. Every failure is a step closer to success. I tried to leave my marriage 5 times, and I could say I failed each time, but it wasn't really failure because each time I learned another roadblock that I need to conquer in order to finally be successful the 6th time. So I think the only failure is not getting back up and trying again.
How about that? And just as a little postscript, guess who just started medical school in September? Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for that, Samra. SAMRA ZAFAR and Lynn Gehl, everyone. What an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to you both. Really appreciate it. You're getting a standing ovation, Lynn and Samra.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Amazing courage. Thank you all. Awesome. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again soon. Hélène, over to you.
To thank you, Lucy, for...
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Lynn. Happy birthday to you.
Because what's a birthday without a little public acknowledgement / humiliation? I just also want to say how awesome you are as a director of this festival and all the people that are part of your team. They didn't put me up to say this. I'm just a bystander, but I just want to say it's so awesome. And happy Halloween.
Just to say that Anne Winship is the creator of the fair trade. Wakefield is a fair trade town, and the owner of Bean Fair Coffee, which I love. Thank you. But I can't thank you with these glasses on. It's just not. It's just
They're
not.
They're so awesome.
I wanted to thank you for hosting our evening with such heart, with such curiosity, and with such warmth. Thank you so much, Lucy.
My pleasure. Yes, thank you, Lucy. This was incredible. I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Lucy, was it 2 years ago in Ottawa? And I was so thrilled when I learned that I would be on stage with her again. So thank you. This was phenomenal. Yeah.
So now I invite you to go, to go and look at the book table, and Samra is most pleased to sign your book. And Lynn is offering some sema seeds, some tobacco seeds, and also a turkey vulture feather to those because she can't be here to sign. to those who buy her books, and it's Paul Brown who can help us out in that. So thank you, and thank you to our incredible community for coming out and supporting us again this year. Without you, we wouldn't be here. So thank you very much, and to all a very happy Halloween. And Winship.